if you think about it at its core, and for those that aren't familiar with swimming, it's both a team and an individual sport. So you're training together as a team. You're actually competing against one another when it comes down to the meets. But I equate a lot of that, and we can talk about this around how I think about investing and how you look at people's strengths and matching those up.
Superclusters is where we demystify the secrets, stories, and tactics behind the money that moves the venture capital world. Welcome back, Superclusters fans, and today we have the amazing Lisa Cawley. Lisa Cawley is the Managing Director of Screendoor, a highly respected LP of GPs. And yes, you heard that right, limited partner of general partners. That will expand a lot more in this episode later on, with a unique model for partnering with allocators to access the emerging manager ecosystem. And as of the time of this recording, they've also recently added 4 new stellar experienced GP advisors, the announcement of which I'll link in the show notes below. You've probably seen and heard from her from numerous LP conferences, and she's been covering venture capital for more than a dozen years, since 2010 at Ernst and Young, a private investment firm, and now at Screendoor. We cover a lot of ground here, but 3 things I really want to call out. 1, I really like her swimming analogy, how venture is as much a team sport and an individual sport, just like swimming. 2, how Screendoor actually helps GPs with firm building. And I want to bifurcate that with fund building and firm building. Expand a lot more later on. And third of which, how Lisa's childhood shapes the way she thinks about venture today. And so, Lisa, I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite a bit of time, ever since our mutual friend Caroline first suggested you come on back in season 1. So, without further ado, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Delighted to be here.
And so, there are a couple things we can start with, but 2 things in particular first. First off, a round of applause is in order because, Lisa, congratulations on joining the newest class of the Kauffman Fellows. And as you know already, you are in phenomenal company. And we'll get on all to the LP VC stuff later in this conversation, but I do want to say congratulations first before I forget. The second of which is, Lisa, you are beloved. I did probably the greatest number of smile and dials, to quote something from your teammate Jamie Rode, for this podcast episode to date. And the number of just raving fans you have in the LP ecosystem is phenomenal. And it is awe-inspiring in so many different ways. So a lot of these questions are seeded by people who are in the ecosystem. Some will be named by name, some for the sake of anonymity, and we can talk about this post-recording. They just love you.
It's an honor. It's a privilege.
And so maybe to rewind the clock here, back to your days in Loyola, and maybe a bit further as well. So a little birdie who will go nameless, but whose first name starts with the letter H, as in Hunter, and last name rhymes with walk, told me that, quote unquote, you were a pretty hardcore swimmer. And as someone who was both on the varsity volleyball team as well as a club swimmer outside of Catonsville High School team, how did you think about, or how did you first find your way into the sport where your perfume brand was chlorine and your best friend was sunscreen?
It's funny you should say that because I distinctly remember going to morning practice at Loyola and then having to trudge my way into class, and the chlorine would follow you everywhere. So that was very much the scent of my life for so many years. But I originally actually started swimming back when I was 6 years old. And so it has been a part of my life. It still is a part of my life now, albeit taking on different shapes throughout. But I learned from a very young age. I was fortunate where my mother let me try everything. So I tried sports from gymnastics to lacrosse and field hockey. That was a disaster. Soccer, softball. Like I was able to try everything, which I think is just the best experience as a young child. But swimming was what I think I fell in love with. And the thing I love, looking back on it now about swimming is not only the competitive spirit that it drove in me, but also the fact that if you think about it at its core, and for those that aren't familiar with swimming, it's both a team and an individual sport. So you're training together as a team, you're actually competing against one another when it comes down to the meets. But At the same time, you also are competing for a team score. So it's this weird individual dynamic of you're oftentimes maybe if you're going up against a certain team at a meet, your best event, it might not be the most strategic thing for you to be swimming your best event. And you may want your teammate to be in that event and you to be in your second or third tier event. And so I equate a lot of that, and we can talk about this around how I think about investing and how you look at people's strengths and matching those up. But it instilled a ton of discipline where, in college especially, I would have 2-hour morning practices, right? Up at 5:30, 2 hours in the pool all year round, go to class, go to study hall, and then again in the afternoon, evening, you would have doubles some days where you would be back in the pool for 2 hours or have weight training. And then study hall and all of the things that were required of student athletes. And I'm pretty confident I actually got better grades in season than out of season, not by much, but it's the concept of you only have a certain set number of hours to get things done, and if it doesn't get done then it's never going to get done. So I absolutely love swimming. I think it also, I'm sure if you were to speak to someone who's more medically knowledgeable, I would believe it's probably one of the best things that you can do as part of your routine, especially as you get older. But I absolutely loved it.
There's a line that reminds me of kudos to this author by the name of Brandon Sanderson, and he's a fictional author, writes these books called like Mistborn and a bunch of others. Highly recommend reading it. But given that he writes a lot about magic, he has like what he calls three Sanderson's laws of magic. One of those laws happens to be, and I'm paraphrasing here, that limitations are more interesting than superpowers. And the reason I bring that up is you mentioned that you got slightly better grades during season than when you're out of season. And those were breeding grounds of constraints because you knew you had to be working out 6, give or take more hours a day. You had to really time box and discipline your time accordingly. I do want to go on the swimming analogy of like how this applies to team and individual sport kind of thing. But there's one thing I'd be remiss not to ask you about, which is completely off schedule. But because you mentioned this just earlier, you mentioned you tried a bunch of sports since you were 6. And one of the sports that you tried was field hockey, and you said it was a disaster. And just for personal curiosity, like why was it a disaster?
It was a short summer camp stint, running around a field. So insert running. Running and swimming, by the way, totally different sports. Use totally different muscles. Like the endurance is different. If somebody disagrees with that, please help me. I would love to know the secret. But bending over, the hand-eye coordination just didn't jive for me. Just wasn't there.
I'm with you as well. I'm curious. What is your how proficient are you with water polo? Because there is a level of hand-eye coordination, but it is still in the water.
So I actually think water polo, it's like a combination of, and we would play. Those were like the fun days where we'd like, twice a year show up and it's water polo Friday and we don't have to actually do a hard set that morning. It's like a combination of rugby and football in the water. So it's quite rough depending on, the teams and manner in which you're playing. I'd say they're similar, but again, you still have that hand-eye coordination and it's a team sport still.
I will say water polo is by far, in my opinion, one of the most violent sports out there. And I say this especially for the girls' water polo. Because, and this is something I learned in high school, and obviously if you take it to a more professional level, then it gets more intense. But referees would come by, before you jump in the water, would come by to evaluate if you have, like, what your fingernail length is.
Yes.
You know what I'm talking about, right?
I do. I know the secret, yeah.
That there is a secret, and I'm not going to name any of my former high school classmates or anything, but I have had friends who have sharpened their fingernails in ways that I'm like, I don't think that's ethical. But what you see above the water is people are handling a ball and trying to throw it into the other goal. Underneath the water is a whole different level of savagery. And I say all that, I'm curious from water polo Fridays twice a year kind of thing, where you're not playing as competitively as people who are like going to Olympics playing water polo. Does it get nearly as violent when you're playing it twice a year?
Well, if you take, I don't know, depends on how big the teams were, call it 15, 30, 45 people who are ultra competitive at the sport that they already do and now are doing something for leisure. Like you can't just like shed your competitive gene. It doesn't work that way. And if it does, I would argue that maybe that person's not as competitive as you would think. I certainly am guilty of that, where you just can never drop that competitive spirit. So I think that's your answer.
Speaking of competition on a broader level, and I love that you tied in nicely to my next question here, which is I'm curious how much of your day's training, and I kid you not, when Hunter says, oh, sorry, you know, someone whose name rhymes with the letter H and last name rhymes, sorry, starts with the letter H, rhymes with walk, for his last name. How much of your days training out alongside NCAA Division One athletes influences the way you think about competitive drive in people outside of what's on paper? Because this is a broader level of question. You can apply it to LP venture stuff or otherwise. But if you look at most people's resume, which are like one, maybe 2 pages at most, then they have every single, like, here's what I did in this job title. I influenced 10% revenue growth, whatever it is, right? Are there things you look at when you're hiring someone, when you're investing in someone, that are telltale signs of competitive spirit? Because you kind of need that in this kind of world, that might have been influenced from your days as a swimmer.
Yeah, I think some of it actually comes back to a scrappiness and a willingness to commit to doing the hard thing when there's not instant gratification waiting for you. So in the sport of swimming, when you think about this, you're training and you're training for months and months and months. And I think the way that I'd say the non-swimming community is the most familiar with this is this concept of around the Olympics, which is like I always get excited about because it's the one time swimming gets like the real airtime in the sports world. But there are folks that you train for months, for years, right? Obviously 4 year stints in between the Olympics for one 30-second race, for one 1 minute race, right? Like you are putting hours and hours and days and your entire regimen and discipline into that for one decision, one process. And I think that is so similar to venture if you think about it. Whether you're a founder, whether you're a GP, whether you're an LP, you are spending all of your time in preparation mode, in build mode, in monitoring mode, all for that one moment, right? And that one moment, whatever that's going to be defined by, is going to be different for everybody. It could be the exit outcome, it could be the major customer, it could be that DPI piece, it could be something related to a fund metric. It could be if you're an LP making a really important grant to the communities that you serve, right? Like that shouldn't always be defined the same way for everybody. But when I think about finding that in folks, you're looking for this combination of scrappiness and discipline, where when the two of those intersect, somebody has a very consistent persistence in how they conduct themselves in doing the hard thing when they know that they're not going to get that result that they're working hard towards in the next hour, in the next day, in the next quarter.
There are things that we do either as an athlete or in venture that lead to outsized outcomes, and it's honestly sometimes really small. And I'll give credit where this is due. I first heard this from Ho Nam at Altos Ventures, who is a phenomenally candid individual, and for being in the venture industry for like 25 years plus kind of thing, he's just like so down to earth. But one thing he said is that most people are familiar with the 80-20 rule, where it's like, 80% of your results are influenced by 20% of your efforts, give or take, right? But if you take that a level deeper, you'll then have like, if you apply 80-20 to that 80-20, you'll end up getting 4% of your efforts lead to 64% of your results. And then you do that one more time, the 80-20 thing again, you'll have 0.8, roughly 0.8% leads to 51, I think 51.2 if I'm doing my math right, but feel free to set the record straight. Your CPA and CFA license can come in and correct me and do my math. But it's effectively to say that like give or take 1% of your efforts lead to the majority, 51% of the outcomes. And so much of swimming also is just like, it is the equivalent of the 10-year overnight success. And so I'm curious, to make this more tactical and surgical, how do you detect scrappiness and the amount of effort people put into something, either through conversation or on paper?
I think most of it does end up happening through a conversation, and I think it's really hard to discern that in one point in time. And I think that's why venture is probably so relationship driven, especially at the LP level as well, where you're looking to connect these dots and these data points that you have. And when you get them, they often don't look like data points, right? Like they aren't, just somebody sending through a spreadsheet, hey, here's the next update, right? It's how many conversations have you had with this individual? How have they conducted themselves? When you see them when things are going well, when you see them when things are going hard, right? Because by the way, everybody has challenges and obstacles that they go through. And if somebody says that they don't, they're lying. I think I have them every week, which again is expected in this business. I think it's why I love this business because it constantly challenges you in those ways. So I think the best way to learn that is actually not through a singular conversation, but rather through lots of conversations and lots of interactions with people in lots of different settings. Like my favorite ways to work with LPs or to work with managers are not necessarily through Zooms or manufactured, recurring phone calls. It's actually, over a meal or, going for a walk or doing something that has actually nothing to do with feeling like you're conducting business and you're actually just getting to know somebody. Because I often say if you're governing things from a point of a legal document, whatever that may be, and having to refer to that in order to trigger a behavior, that often to me feels emblematic of a transaction, not of a relationship. If you have a relationship, you are not going to be, hey, in section 2.573, the legal term and all of its confusion and 25 additional words that maybe don't need to be there says this, so we need to do this. That's a transaction, which has its place, by the way, has its place. I understand. Like at the end of the day, and I did this for many years at EY, there are legal documents in place all for a reason because this is business. But I believe there's a different way to go about managing relationships and building trust with people and working through those relationships over time through those obstacles, through those ups and downs, peaks and valleys.
Well, that was our mic drop moment there. So if we want to end the conversation here, well, we can end the conversation here. I'm kidding. Um, that's such a good line, and that's the reason I wanted you to re-emphasize that, because there are a lot of folks out there who will tie a relationship to what is on the written word. Too often, I've seen kind of the best relationships between LPs and GPs, or even like VCs to founders, where it's like, yes, it's technically in the legal document, but given an extraneous time, a black swan time, something that's just like, we didn't foresee when we signed the legal document, we will waive this portion, right? And for like between LPs and GPs, sometimes that's like capital calls, like, given the, I think when I saw a lot of this in 2022, where it's like, hey, you know what? We've over allocated to venture and, because of that, we need I need an extra like 3 months before we can do a capital call. And sometimes there's a default rate or something like that. You like to pay a penalty, but a lot of GPs like, we're in this for the long term. This is a long term marriage. We won't tie you to that, and it's more of a in good faith kind of thing. And the same thing is true for like founders to VCs, and sometimes, I kid you not, I've actually seen. I'm sure maybe you can qualify this as well. Some LPs have extensive side letters to GPs, and sometimes in those side letters, like, we want quarterly reports or whatever reports by this date, and they will tie you to that day. And sometimes a GP needs a 1 or 2 day grace period. That said, I think there's the level of discipline that GPs also need to have.
Yeah, and I think maybe a comment on the legal terms more broadly is two things. I think one, it's important to understand that even to your point around, LPs needing certain side letter terms, there's often a reason for that, is related to the business that they're running and they're responsible for. They have stakeholders too. And so as a GP, and we do this when we're working with our GPs at Screendoor, is it's really important to understand what those needs are, what those requirements, who the stakeholders are, how they work with it, how the investment team works with those stakeholders. Because again, I think it comes down to that's a relationship building element. You understand not just your immediate relationship, but the ripple effects from that relationship. And at the end of the day, the legal terms are important. And I think it's so, so, so important for GPs and especially emerging GPs to know what their legal terms are and to take ownership over those. So it's not, oh, the lawyers wanted this. It's that's your LPA. Those are your terms. And it's okay if you don't know on day one what those are as you're going through the prep and the fund formation process. But by the time you sign on the dotted line and wrap up that fundraise, one, congratulations, that's so exciting. But two, you should know what all of those terms are and know what your basis for having those terms set the way that they are. Like, I believe it is the GP's responsibility to take ownership over those terms. I think it's why we work with a lot of our GPs and helping them through that and understand, hey, here's what it is at face value. Here's what these words actually say. But here's in practice how that could impact you for better or for worse in the future. And a lot of the legal terms arguably are hopefully things that are corner cases, right? Edge cases that we hope never, ever, ever happen. But by way of venture being a long duration business, 10 plus extensions, there is a probability, right, that those things do come into play. And so that's why they exist. But managing from those on a, hour to hour basis is perhaps not as productive and not, again, it's a transactional approach as opposed to a relationship approach.
I do want to, I'm going to be honest, I do want to go back on a thread of the team versus individual analogy between swimming as well as venture. Because in swimming, you described it so accurately, which is like you are competing and scoring points for a team, and sometimes that's not putting yourself in the best event. But at the end of the day, you are trying to get your PR, personal records, PB, on kind of the board. That dynamic, could you walk through the analogy of how much that relates to venture as a whole? Because sometimes, I'm be honest, there's like partnerships, and in many ways, depending if you're a consensus driven firm or a conviction driven firm, like you might need to slam the table to do a certain deal. So, anyways, I'm going to pause there. I'm going to get off my soapbox, but could you draw that parallel between swimming and venture?
So I think about it a lot in terms of the team at Screendoor. So myself, Lane Johnson, and Jamie Rode, and we're all looking to make the best investments on behalf of Screendoor. And in some ways, Jamie may look at, my partner Jamie may look at an investment and say, I really love this portfolio construction, this investment strategy, this advantage in terms of attracting the best founders. Here's what I believe as an individual investor is a really strong investment. And I think that it will be has the potential to be a top performer on behalf of Screendoor. So that's her individual decision contributing to the benefit of the team. And then Lane and I have the ability to go through and offer our additional perspectives so that we can make that the best Screendoor decision based off of what one individual has identified. So we each have our strengths and we each have our own styles that may attract different investors, that may attract different types of GPs. But at the end of the day, while we're all building individual and team relationships with those people, it is the team. It is the team score on the board. It is Screendoor's score on the board, right? And whatever metrics we'll measure that as, that actually matters.
And speaking of team, I know like I will plead guilty in the sense that I haven't allocated calories to this nearly as enough as I would like. But in the world of venture, there are firms like Benchmark where you have, a small number of partners. And when a partner invests, you really have access to that one partner and they live and breathe your company, right? And then you have other firms that are more platform driven, which is like the equivalent of like Andreessen Horowitz or Sequoia, where you have access to a wider and broader team. And the question to you effectively is when Screendoor invests, when Jamie invests, when you invest, post investment, is it more access to the broader team and Hunter and Sacha and Eileen and, Charles and everyone else who's like kind of come and built this together? Or is it mainly like Lisa was the one who like pounded the table for this deal and Lisa will be your main point of contact and she will be the person to triage additional conversations?
Yeah, so when you see Screendoor investing, the way to think about that is that this is an LP of GPs. So not only do you have three allocators who have deep experience allocating to venture over time across multi-asset class portfolios, but you also have now 14 GPs who have been there, done that. They've built firms, all of which have come about in very different ways, which I think is really important. We always say there's no one size fits all approach to if you follow these five things very precisely, you'll have the best venture capital firm, because I think that's different for everybody. But when you see screen door investing, you get access to that entire lineup of folks. And now you may lean into, one more than the other, right? Somebody may connect with Lane more frequently, but you have access to all of us and we're all available to help you where if there's something that's my strength. So for example, it could be operational, it could be legal, it could be compliance. Those are often areas that I'm helping with frequently. Happy to jump in and I would be your main point of contact there. If it's something around adjusting your portfolio construction and thinking through really meaty dynamics there, obviously Jamie has a lot of experience with that and would be somebody to jump into the fold. And then we have our GP advisor model where what we do is we assign two of those GP advisors to every manager in our portfolio. And so you have not only three individuals that can give you very different LP experiences from our backgrounds, but you also have those two GPs that you're formally working with that everything from, gosh, I have a pay to play situation that I'm in. How do I think about and maximize this for the benefit of the fund, preserving my relationships? Very tactical questions, but also very strategic questions around, hey, I've raised my fund one and I'm a solo GP, but I would like to bring on a partner. How should I think about going through and bringing on that partner? What should the time development be? How should I think about pressure testing that relationship? How do I think about the economics that go into that? And the whole point of that is that by having somebody who can provide you that additional context from their experience, you just widen your aperture for being able to make a better decision on how, that fund manager themselves in our portfolio wants to go about that process. So we're not there to give you the answers. We're just there to give you perspective so that you have the most perspectives available to you to make the best decision on behalf of your firm and the vision that that GP has for their firm over time. And it's our hope that by doing that and offering that, quote unquote, post investment support or value add, right? The value add, it's the easiest thing to say, but the hardest thing to actually do repeatedly in practice. Hopefully, by doing that, we're giving that manager a different advantage when you think about the enduring brand that they hope to be building.
I want to put a pin in value add because that is something I love our audience to get like a deeper exposure to as well in terms of how to validate that. But before we get into that, I'm curious. I like actually like Hunter Walk, who is your teammate. I don't know if he's written this on a blog post because I know he's a pretty prolific writer in of itself. But I remember reading it in this book by Scott Belsky, The Messy Middle, and Hunter offered a lot of thoughts there. And I'm going to paraphrase here, which is, I believe he said something along the lines of, if you sometimes listen to your investors' advice, you might fail. If you always listen to your investors' advice, you're guaranteed to fail. And what I really like what you said about the Screendoor LP of GPs, like the GP advisory model, is that it is not prescriptive of this is what you need to do, but here, let me offer you tools in your toolkit. And as a GP, you evaluate once you have additional references, what you need to do that's best for your firm. Am I encapsulating that right? And like, am I understanding that right?
Exactly.
Gotcha. And so I'm curious, you have an amazing kind of like GP advisory board, like, just to name a few. I'm obviously like, you're the founding GPs, so to speak, of this GP advisory board, included like Satya and kind of like Hunter at Homebrew, but also like Charles at Precursor, Eileen at Cowboy, and a bunch of these other ones. And recently you added, Mar at Pair, and Rob at First Round, and Zal at Refactor, and YE at like Reach, right? Just to name a few. And I'm just throwing a bunch of names for the audience if people aren't familiar with them. But I'm really curious, speaking on the world of aligning incentives, that how do you think about, from a Screendoor perspective, how do you align incentives between you, Screendoor, the GPs that are advising these emerging GPs, and the GPs themselves?
If you're raising your fund one and you want to be a solo GP and you expect to be a solo GP for the entire vision of your fund, you're likely to want to connect with somebody like Charles Hudson because you've seen his track record, you've seen how he conducts himself and the amazing firm that he's built over time. And so the point with Screendoor coming together is that now this is a collective doing that. It's good for new managers to enter the fold. It gives LPs choices in terms of who they back. It gives founders choices in terms of who they take capital from. And that's extremely healthy for the ecosystem and really, really, really important for the future of it. And so what they get out of it, if you think about everybody's most valuable currency, for me, and I think arguably a lot of folks, it's time. It's the only thing that we all have the same of, and you never get it back. And so they're spending their time with these managers in a way that that's the most valuable thing that they could ever spend.
I also there's so many fund ones and fund twos I see these days that when they showcase their existing LPs or LPs that have committed so far in their first close, there's immense pride in them when there's an established GP that is on it that is in their LP base. I'm like, oh, Charles invested, or like Mark Andreessen invested, and there's like this level of pride that it's almost like fun to look at from a very like endearing perspective, which is you see them beam up. It's like, hey, you know what? There's external validation in all this, and these are folks that upon fund close, I can call up whenever because I will have questions on portfolio construction, or should I do this deal, or how much of a check size should I do? Should I do pro rata? Should I do re-ups? All these kind of things. So I think it makes a lot of sense from Screendoor just syndicating a bunch of this expertise and then sharing that expertise with emerging GPs. You mentioned that when you do invest in a fund one, fund two kind of thing, that you would probably, I don't know if that's the right term, but assign 3 GPs in your advisory board, or 2 to 3 GPs in your advisory board to consult, advise them. How is that usually assigned? Is it? I'm pretty sure it's not random. But is there a rhyme or reason, or is there more of a science to who gets assigned to what?
Yeah, we try to be really thoughtful with that. So first and foremost, right, like we're doing this on behalf of the managers in our portfolio. So if they have preferences for who they want, we absolutely want to do our best to honor that. But as part of that, and I think that this does naturally happen throughout their preferences and when we talk with them and go through that, you want to think about, I used the solo GP example before. Another obvious example there would be a sector, right? If somebody has, a sector approach that they're leaning into, or one of the themes that they're pursuing as part of their fund strategy, and they see that reflected in one or many of the managers in our GP advisor group, like we often are thinking through, is that the right match for them? The other piece is when we think about the type of firm that these managers want to build over time, who has come from that type of firm, who has built that over time, and can we put those folks together so that they can see, how the seeds of that evolve, right? What the decision making is like, how you think about that over a multi-fund decision making dynamic, as opposed to, again, venture, I always say, is this crazy thing that we all do where we are in extremely fast decision making timeframes with very short myopic views while also trying to balance things over extremely long time horizons. It's bizarre, right? It's the strangest part when you look at other asset classes. You're making these decisions and making these predictions, and obviously very educated predictions, and coming with a prepared mind to things. But you're doing this for such a long period of time where there are also a lot of very short term implications.
I was chatting with a friend of mine, family office, and he believes that for alternatives there should be a complexity premium. I think that's what he calls it. And venture is one of those, right? It's like going exactly to what you mentioned. There is a complexity premium of all these different incentives and time horizons, and you somehow, as the GP or the LP allocating towards this asset class, have to align them all.
Well, and I think, like, talk about complex. I mean, if there's, I think it was PitchBook data that referenced there's over 4,000 emerging managers. And if you're an LP and you're looking to allocate to emerging managers for the first time, or for the first time, add a new manager to an existing batch of venture that you have, it's next to impossible to sort through all of those managers to find the one. And so that's part of what we do on behalf of, for our LPs, is help them find, we hope that we're backing folks that will one day become, the next generational brands in venture. And that's who we're seeking out. And so by us being solely focused on this area of the market, we have those reps, we see those managers come through our pipeline and get to learn from them too, which I think is really important, right? Like we're learning from somebody who's building a business. And so we always like to say, look, we're building a firm for firm builders by firm builders. And so that dynamic alone is fundamentally different.
I for sure will follow up with a question on firm building versus fund building, because I think there's a complexity there as well. Because there are some folks who are just like, I'm gonna do 3 funds, and that's all there is to it, right? And it's more of a representation of themselves. And there are other folks who are like, I want to build a legacy of an institution that outlives probably my own stake as a GP. But before I get into that, I want to talk about LP profiles. And one of the things we talked about in our conversations before is, and I completely agree, which is there are some GPs will come to you or myself or other folks who are like, hey, I want to raise from LPs, and then full stop, period. That's all there is to it. Could you explain the nuance behind the different personas of LPs out there and what kinds of LPs are best suited for what types of funds or what stage of funds?
I see this all the time. It's where are the LPs? How do I find the LPs? Why are they hiding from me? Most often they're not actually hiding, but it is a very, very opaque landscape.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important to remember, and this is the case too, I think LP to LP, right? Finding other LPs that are like-minded that you can collaborate with. There needs to be some connective tissue there. And so when you look at the LP landscape, there, of course, there's the categories. So there's your pensions, endowments, foundations, single family, multifamily offices, corporates, all of those different categories that I think have, fortunately, in the world we live in, there's a bit more education available to folks around those. But I think it's really important to dig a layer deeper and remember that you could have, and this is an old family office line, right? Once you've seen one family office, you've seen one family office because they're all so different. And I think that you could probably say that phrase even endowment to endowment, foundation to foundation, maybe even pension to pension. And so it's really important to remember that when you're talking with an LP in any category, that they may have fundamentally different asset allocations from one another. So if you have two family offices side by side, you could have one who has a really deep, extensive portfolio in venture, and you could have one who aspires to, but they need to build that out. And they have different check sizes, they have different liquidity demands on behalf of the families that they represent. And all of those things go into who's a good fit for any given fund. So we do a lot of education with managers around it's not about finding LPs, it's about finding the right LP GP fit and finding the folks who you fit a spot in their portfolio that they're targeting. Like you want to be spending time with the believers, not necessarily convincing the skeptics in a way.
And so to double click on something you mentioned earlier, which is every family office is technically their own beast, right? And if you know one, you only know one. You can't really cross reference to everyone else. To make this a bit more concrete, could you describe the nuances between like liquidity demands and all these other things? Like imagine like let's say I'm an emerging GP, let's say $10 million fund, fund one, and I'm just like, Lisa, I want to talk to LPs. Like I need all the LPs I need. Like what would your feedback be for me and for like a $10 million fund one? Like what kind of LP should I be targeting if we were to role
I
play?
think Yeah, I think family offices and candidly high net worth investors, they obviously play a pretty major role at the early stages of a fund one and a fund two, even where they're helping get those folks in business. So I certainly don't want to discount them as well. But family offices are a really important part of the emerging manager ecosystem. And so when you think about the liquidity profile, maybe I'll take the first part of your question. There can be, let's say we have two family offices. There can be one family office where you're managing what's called G1, Generation 1, Generation 2 capital. So that means that that is like where the liquidity event was created that kind of manifested into the family office. And so through that, you may have that individual actively involved in the decision making for the investments that are in their portfolio. They may be sitting there, they may be on the committee, they may be actively meeting with managers. And then the second piece of that is the liquidity, where they have their spending lifestyles, their spending needs for their lifestyle. They have whatever their desires are for other asset classes, right? Because it's important to remember that venture is just one piece of many portfolios. They have, many folks are very philanthropic, and so they may have commitments that they've made there or desire to make. And all of those go into play with how much they can commit. And of course, when you think about the illiquidity and the locked up nature of the capital with venture, that's really important. The second example would be somebody where it's, call it G5 capital. So they are removed from any liquidity event. They are diversified out of, anything that came about from that wealth creation event. And they typically look more like what I would just say is an investment firm, right? They don't look like a traditional family office. The family may or may not be involved in the decision making. You may not even know who the family is because, again, these are all individuals where if you're working at a family office, like I always viewed, it's very important to maintain the privacy and confidentiality of those people, right? They have their own lives, they have their own ambitions, and that's part of our role in those situations. So with those family offices, they may have a more robust portfolio. They may be able to do more dynamic things depending on how much time they've had to evolve that portfolio over time. And they will probably still have the same, call it liquidity needs, but they might look a little bit different. They may be focused more on generational wealth transferring, on, of course, the charitable component. And many, again, are still very philanthropic, and that's an important part of their legacy. But those are two very different family office profiles where venture can absolutely play a role, but it may play a role in how much they commit, how often they commit, how they work with managers. One may, again, they just are not necessarily in and out of the asset class very deeply. So being embedded with a manager versus somebody working at a traditional investment firm, they, have a different perspective on what they're looking for with a manager.
I'm curious for the generation ones and twos part of the family office side of things. Does the source of wealth impact their allocation strategy in the sense that, let's say they made their wealth on a textile business? Does that mean they lean more towards private equity and hedge funds and making these kind of categories up? And if they made their source of wealth from they exited $1 billion tech business, they're more inclined for venture capital. Does that usually impact what their allocation strategy looks like for the G1s and G2s?
I'll take your textile example. So if you've made your capital in an industrial business, there's two things. One, you may actually have strategic knowledge that could benefit somebody also investing in the industrial business, so you may lean into those investments. The flip side of that is, because you've made your capital in that situation, you may actually want the tech exposure because you don't have the tech exposure because you've only previously had the industrial side of the equation. So I think it truly depends. It depends on, and that's where the family can influence a lot of what their desire is for that capital. But there's a lot of advising that goes into that from, experts that they can come in and consultants that can help them as they think about what they want their legacy to actually be.
So I want to fulfill a promise, or fulfill two promises to our audience. I put two things on the back burner for long enough. One of which is the concept of firm building, and the other is value add. And I want to touch on both before we round out for the last part of this conversation, because, oh my God, we have not gotten through the vast majority of questions in which we prepared. Uh, but on the context of, and I'll put in your quote actually, for firm building or value add, is there one that you'd like to tackle first? And then we can kind of go with that for now.
Let's start with firm building.
Firm building. All right. So there's a really interesting thing, and I read this, I believe, on either Screendoor's website and or your recent announcement where you added 4 new GP advisors. Screendoor's goal isn't just to help new VCs raise funds. We want to help our managers build lasting firms. And so if you'll allow me to put that under a microscope, what does building a lasting firm mean to you and your team? Is it by vintage of fund, number of fund, Roman numeral, or does it mean something else?
Yeah, so our model is that we want folks where it's our goal to help our LPs build relationships with these managers directly and have them as part of their portfolio in the future when they're right sized for them. So, as we all know, there's a lot of reasons why larger allocators have a challenge in accessing this area of the market. Certainly not due to their brands, but rather just structurally due to check size, team bandwidth. And so, oftentimes, they're unable to actually access this area of the market and write checks directly. And they may have a mandate where, whether it's fund size, hey, I need this to be a fund 3 before I can actually write a direct fund commitment, or I need it to be, $100 million fund. And so, we'll have funds that certainly have plans and ambitions to raise funds that will increase in sizing over time. That's part of their mapping and their plan. But we also have funds that will always maintain, $40 million every 3 years, right? That's what they'll raise. That's what their strategy is. And when you look back on the history of venture, we've all seen success with both of those models, right? There's lots of examples around those. So when we think about what's defining success, we also don't put bounds on that, just like we don't put bounds on, what a solo GP or a team is better, right? All of those kind of continually debated questions. There's always data that's going to show one versus the other, but success to us is one, our LPs having direct relationships with those managers. Certainly the first marker is, of course, performance, right? Because performance is everybody's right to continue to do their business in this world of venture. But then also that they're a lasting brand, right? That they have navigated. I think one of the most challenging things to navigate is actually succession, which is such a crazy thing to think about when you're just raising your first fund. But when you look back at brands, right, which brands have endured, they've navigated through what that succession will look like. And that can take a lot of different ways. It can be, hey, this will never exist beyond this partnership right here. This is the brand. Or this will exist, and here's, the transition plan down the line. And this will be a brand that, is bigger than any one individual.
It's the equivalent. We actually had Jacqueline at Foundry Group for last season, and as we all know, they made a public announcement on this that 2022 was going to be their last fund, and it was just like Brad and the team were just like, hey, you know what? This Foundry goes as far as our own legacies, and we don't like plan for this to go even further. And so because of that, that was kind of the general. I'm not speaking as if I were them, but this is like based on what I've read online and based on a few of my conversations. But it's like, we're going to end with this. We're going to end with our 2022 fund. And there are other funds who are like, hey, you know what? I want to like retire, or I want to like, I want to like, when I pass away, I still want this firm to be around, which is a very different conversation, a very different set of like things you put in place for that firm to make sure that it continues to succeed each other. Okay. I want to talk more about succession planning, but you have something?
I was going to say, I think one of the most interesting debates, actually, like what I do think is a debate I don't have an answer to, but I love getting other people's perspective on, is when you think about venture and different from like, this is what I actually find to be more fascinating than like the solo GP versus team and sector versus generalist, is in venture, it's all of a sudden you're looking at something and you're evaluating somebody's experience, right? And I think that's a lot of why fund ones are tricky for allocators to look at, right? If you're not looking at them in a different and unique way, you're looking and you're like, gosh, I need to see the experience. I need to see the experience. But then all of a sudden, as you think about again how long these partnerships go on for and the actual term of the fund, well, wait, are they really in it for much longer? Because when you think about the 10 years, so there's this dynamic of too young, and then all of a sudden, it's like, wait, they might be too old because I don't know that they're actually going to be managing this portfolio. And I don't know why that is. I mean, I don't know the answer. I don't know the right. It's almost like, the joke about like an avocado, right? Like it's ripe for like 5 seconds. And so, like that dynamic and finding somebody where they have just that right balance of experience that you can see that they can build this firm, but then also are still incentivized to continue to do that time and time again. Such a fascinating concept to me.
Oh, that is, I love that you likened it to an avocado. So viewers and
It's not
listeners,
that simple. It's not that simple, but we all know that joke.
we do know that joke. But I think it's such a useful way of framing it as well, because that Goldilocks zone, so to speak, if I were to use an astrophysical analogy, is only so small. And there's too much on one end, there's too little on the other end. So the second promise I want to fulfill to our audience is the topic of value add. And it is often a very nebulous concept for a lot of folks, because every investor will say, at least from a fund one, fund two, like you have to be value add, right? In a lot of ways. How do you evaluate? How do you underwrite if someone is actually adding value to their portfolio? And this is probably a secondary conversation onto this. I imagine a lot of this comes through via reference calls and reference checks. How many reference calls are technically enough to understand if someone is adding value?
Yeah, so you're spot on. I think a lot of that you do get through the reference conversations. And I think that for us at Screendoor, one of the advantages we have is being able to tap into GP advisors for helping with those reference calls through their networks. And so everybody knows, there's always the on sheets, but there's also the off sheets. And I find that, when we have, we're fortunate to have these GP advisors that have amazing reputations. They've been investors for such a long time. They have built up extensive networks. And so it's very strategic that we can triage and kind of get to anyone to have just a perspective. And I might take maybe a slightly different approach in how I think about referencing, where I think some might look at it as like some may look at it as confirmatory. Some may look at it as more of a discovery process. We certainly do both, but I don't look at it as like a dirt digging expedition. I actually just want to get the holistic picture of somebody, of how they operate when times are tough and how they operate obviously when things are going well. And I think that gives you the best picture of somebody as a human, which at the end of the day, like, we're making bets on people and we're investing in people. And so it's really important to be able to understand and see all of that. So I won't ever say you must do X reference calls and you've cracked the code, because I think you could make arguments on both sides of that coin.
Right.
But I do think that you should be doing enough to get a holistic picture of somebody and how they are, not only as an investor, most importantly as an investor, but just as importantly, how they are as a human. And so, folks that they've worked with over time, founders, co investors, boards, other LPs. But it's an interesting dynamic. And this is where the GP advisors play such an impactful role, where when you think about the relationship of an LP doing a reference call with a founder, obviously, a lot of times when you're going through that process, particularly if it's an off sheet, a founder may not be incentivized to actually share their true perspective. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And I don't criticize that at all. But when you do have a deep relationship with somebody, you're more likely to get more candor from them around that. And I think that's what's been really powerful in our ability to do that referencing at Screendoor when we're looking at managers. And again, looking to get that holistic picture so that we can help them with their blind spots, with their firm building plans, and how to help them be just the best versions of themselves.
So I'm curious, and let me know if I'm putting words in your mouth, at least on the value add perspective of this, is in terms of getting a holistic picture on someone. And also, like, sometimes LPs want to meet founders. Sometimes the founder's just way too busy. If you don't have a prior connection and they're a public company founder or otherwise, like, just to use an extreme of this, if let's say an investor was an early investor in Tesla or SpaceX and you want to get in touch with Elon Musk, there is very little chance you can cold email. I'm assuming there's a very little chance you can cold email like Elon, but you have a higher chance when a GP who's also involved in the ecosystem knows like Elon in one way or another. Obviously, this is an extreme example of this, but sometimes it's not. There's no bad feelings. Just like it's hard because everyone wants to get in front of that said founder slash CEO.
Yeah, and I think when you're an LP and you're evaluating managers and what their value add is, I think the best thing that folks can do as a GP is actually quantify it. And the ways that they can quantify it, again, there's obviously your top line metrics in a fund when you look at performance. Those matter, but they are a little bit different and squishy when you're looking at a fund one. But what I think about that as is when I look through somebody's materials, it's not enough to say that you're unique and differentiated. Every deck says that. Or if it doesn't, what I often tell managers and those that have heard me say this before, it's kind of like when you go into the word processor product on your desktop and you want to build up a template, right? And you're like, hey, where's that resume template? How do I pull that up? It's like if you were to pull up that version of a venture capital pitch deck, it would have the words unique and differentiated in there as the template. And it's your
Yeah,
responsibility by way of communicating your strategy to go in and replace that, right? Like
yeah,
that's the beginning of the sentence, or that's like the find and replace.
yeah.
That's not the sentence. So I always encourage managers to go in and say, hey, look, here's how I've helped this company. I've made X introductions. I have, in terms of customers, I brought on these number of pilots. I've helped them with hiring these 5 roles. I brought them, this number of candidates, whatever your secret sauce and your edge is there. I've helped them with their go to market strategy. I've made 25 sales introductions, like whatever we could list off. And there's no judgment on which one of those is more powerful than not, right? That's all up to the founder, frankly. But that to me, being able to quantify it and show your value add, that's how I think you show and develop your track record to LPs. And if you're an LP, you want to be looking for those things, looking for those data points, because in early stage investing, when a founder is taking pre-seed or seed capital, they're likely also doing so because they recognize that they can extend their resources beyond what they can actually full-time hire for. And so their investors can help them with one or two very specific things, and perhaps the rest of their syndicate can help them with one or two very specific different things.
It's I'm reminded, and I don't want to seem like an encyclopedia at this point or a quote book, but I'm reminded of Peter Drucker's line, "You can't manage what you don't measure." And a lot of, from a GP perspective, you can call yourself a value add investor, but if you're not measuring how much value you're putting into your portfolio companies, then it's the equivalent of that's not a priority for you.
Absolutely.
So I'm curious, and this is something I love. I wish I got to ask every single LP this that I have on the show, but we always run out of time before we run out of topics to talk about. But this is going to be one of the few times I actually get to ask this question, which is, if you could pick any lessons in your life to canonize in a time capsule, which two would you pick?
So the first is definitely to put family first. I think at the end of the day, that's why everybody works hard and has their bigger purpose. And the second is my favorite phrase, and I tell folks this all the time: you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, right? It's akin to like always try, or there's a great, I think it was Theodore Roosevelt quote around, it's not the critic who counts, it's the man or the woman in the arena, right? And I actually have a framed version of that just over my shoulder, but those are definitely the lessons that I think are timeless.
I 100% that Wayne Gretzky line.
Well, it's Wayne Gretzky, Michael Scott. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take if you're an Office fan.
That's fair. That is fair. Sometimes you need the full quote there as well. I tend to forget it because everyone attributes it to Wayne, and I'm like, oh, of course, like it's that. But then, you're right. The Michael Scott also should have attribution on that as well. That's such a great line to put up in a room because, like, just in terms of walking in the room every day, it's like, hey, you know what? This is the ethos. This is the why I'm living my life, and it's important. Like, we live in a business where we need to take shots, and it's so easy to say like, hey, this isn't going to work out because most fund ones, like, there are a million things wrong with fund ones and fund twos in general, right? Like, they haven't gotten succession down, they haven't figured out like specific terms in their LPA, but it's about really picking those like one or two things, in my opinion, that can go really, really right, and that requires having conviction, taking shots.
Absolutely.
Okay, second question here, and I'm curious on your take here. This is the first time I think I'm actually asking this question, although it has stayed on my list for a while. And when we chatted last, you were like, this is something you have multiple thoughts around, but for the sake of time, we'll keep it to quick fire. When was the last time Lisa's OS, operating system, went through a major update as opposed to a hotfix, and what was included in that update?
Yeah, so this is a much bigger answer than perhaps ventured to me, but having my daughter and having a baby, and I think that so my first, and she has made every color in my world brighter, and I think given me a greater sense of purpose than I ever thought I ever had before. And again, we talk about all of the productivity hacks and things like that. There is no greater productivity than knowing that I'm doing something, with her in mind, and her future and her vision, and how apt that we're actually having this conversation on her first birthday, while she's napping, having a great birthday nap. So that to me has been the biggest and best update, and I think has made me more focused and in tune and productive than I ever even knew was possible. And I also, as part of that, I have to give a lot of credit to, the folks that were around me throughout that experience. And I think that's critically important. And, since I have the path here, like I think it's really important just to say that, if you have a colleague or a peer or a friend or an employee who, they've shared that they're expecting in whatever path that may be, the only appropriate response there is congratulations and how can I support you? And I have been very fortunate to be surrounded by folks that when I shared my family news with them. And as I've learned this first year journey of being a parent, I have had so much support and grace around me. So I think my daughter is everything to my husband and I, and gives me a lot of fuel in my day.
And I could tell because before we click record on this, we were talking about a couple of weeks back when your daughter first walked, and just the joy. And so there's like I don't know, like in Asian cultures we call something, there's something we call an eye smile, which is like not only do your lips smile, but your eyes also, like there's eye wrinkles that where there's an eye smile as well. And just the amount of joy and the level of eye smile that you had when you were talking about your daughter walking for the first time, I could just, the joy was contagious. And even when hearing it, I was like, oh man, I can't wait to have kids myself. So I can really tell.
Yeah, she's the best.
So I want to come full circle here. And we talked about from day one when you were like, hey, you know what? When you were 6 years old, you started trying a bunch of sports, and field hockey just wasn't a thing, at least for you. But swimming was, and it sounds like volleyball was as well, because you've made it on the varsity team in high school. If we could go back in time and to the early days, I'm curious because in the process of doing homework for this, okay. I'm gonna list out a bunch of accolades, and I just think it's freaking impressive, Lisa, that you've hit all this. But you're someone who has graduated high school 25% faster than your peers. You are someone, I'm gonna brag about you, but this is like you were in the National Honor Society, National Math Honor Society, National Science Honor Society. I don't know how many honor societies there are out there. You were the treasurer of the National Spanish Honor Society. And I kid you not, you probably collected all the Infinity Stones if you were like Thanos out there. But I'm curious for you, is there some part of your early childhood or early upbringing that people in the world, LPs, GPs, and the like, should understand to better appreciate the person you are today?
Yeah, that's incredible research. You should do diligence on managers. Um,
If you
so I
pay me,
think
I'll do it.
for
I'll do it.
so I think by way just of my background and how I grew up, like I was a total latchkey kid. So I grew up in a blue collar family. I grew up in a single parent household. My mom was a nurse for 40 some years down at shock trauma, and saw the worst of the worst, worked extremely long hours, and I think really instilled this sense of both work ethic but also independence, because again, by way of being a latchkey kid, it's why I think I came to find a love of education, because I found that like education is something that everybody, like you can always lean into reading, learning, and pursuing that. But like nobody can take that away from you, right? It's yours and it's your knowledge. And I love that. And I found that like the ticket was always education to learning and improving yourself. And I think too that there's a lot of parallels there to venture, where I think if you're in venture, you're basically committed to a career of lifelong learning. And in venture, if you think you know everything, you are already behind. And I think those are the folks that have this insatiable curiosity. I am fascinated by. I want to learn from them. I think it's also why I love teaching venture. Right, venture is an apprenticeship business, but I think teaching is actually another way of learning and showing and demonstrating that you have skill there. So for me growing up, like I leaned in hard to education because, my mom was working, 12-hour shifts. I would go to school and then walk down the street to swim practice, do my homework until swim practice started, do practice then for 2 hours, and then sit and wait for my mom to get off work and pick me up while doing my homework. And that was like just such a core tenet of how I grew up. And I always was reading and just absolutely loved that. And I think then as I transitioned, I had a job like the earliest age I possibly could. So I know we've talked about first jobs. My first job was actually working in the snack bar at a pool. So everything, again, it all comes back to swimming, right? Like I was always at the pool or at school. And so I worked in the snack bar. That was like the first job I could have like legally by age. Absolutely loved it, right? It was like kind of running a mini business. You were doing inventory, you were doing customer service. Obviously, there was the cash component, right, and the money movement, but then was a lifeguard. And so I would have, lifeguarding and then swim practice and then back to work taking those extra shifts. And like that's how I actually paid for a lot of my education, aside from, this lovely concept of student loans, where like my books, my food, all of that was, me always kind of like thinking and plotting and planning how I could support myself doing that. And I think too, the other fun thing that I did in mostly in undergrad and later like post grad was I would like as I would kind of like cycle through clothes or whatever, I actually would sell my clothes on eBay.
Oh,
And so
wow.
that yeah, and so I like that was like the mini, sell them, ship them, print out the label. Like, the post office people, I'm sure probably cringed when they saw me coming with like my big bag of like these, 8 by 10 little fluffer envelopes of like whatever, Abercrombie shirt I had managed to get $6 for. And so that was really like I was just very independent in trying to think and always continue to pursue those things. So I think too, from being a latchkey kid who came from that type of background and seeing, my mom working in an industry that again is very service oriented, and there's a deep, deep, I think, rooted sense in me of like you always want to treat everybody with respect, whether it's the person that's taking care of the building, whether it's the person that's letting you in the front door, or it's the person in the corner office. And I think everybody has a day one and everybody has a bad day. Everybody, you never know when you're actually catching somebody what they've been through that day up until that moment. And everybody, of course, hopefully has many, many good days, right? Like that's what we all hope for one another. And I just I compare so much of that to venture where you just never know. And there are probably more challenging times in somebody's venture journey. And I think that those are the most interesting, right? Because those are what really help you develop.
There's a friend of mine recently, and I recently had a conversation about doing ambitious things. And in the world of doing ambitious things, one of the things I think this is, I forget which Olympian first said this. I forget the attribution, which is the rule of thirds. And if you're doing anything ambitious, a third of the time, like things are gonna be like kicking ass. You're like, oh my god, I'm on top of the world. Like I'm just killing it. I'm like the best person out there. A third of the time, it'll be just like, okay, so. Like, things will just trudge along. And the third of the time, it'll really suck. Like you'll be in the trenches and you'll hit your own gut. You're like, why am I doing this? And it is true for at least in venture, like a lot of people doing ambitious things in general, right? What you're doing at Screendoor, what GPs are doing to build their firm or invest in the next generation of innovation, it's hard. Um, and I think it's an important reminder to everyone to always be kind, because you never know what kind of day the other person is having. Uh, I freaking love it. And maybe because I went to Berkeley, and one of the things we were indoctrinated on is student always. Like that's one of the things we were always like learning. And I think it's extra important no matter where you are in your life. And I'm saying this as someone who has very little miles on my odometer and clearly do not have nearly enough facial hair. Although as an Asian, I don't think I'll ever have enough facial hair. So but I think it's important to always learn from the people around you, because you never know what they can teach you. And so last question here, because like Lisa, I need to let you go back to your birthday party, or your daughter's birthday party. So thank you for taking time out of your day to do this. But one thing, as maybe like in this conversation so far, if people couldn't tell, or even in my own research and reference calls I did for this conversation, the thematically the thing that comes up again and again, Lisa, in your life is the fact that you're thoughtful, like extremely thoughtful. In fact, out of the 7 people I asked for this conversation, 6 of them included the word thoughtful in their description of you, unprompted. And I'm pretty sure they didn't compare notes, because I asked them all separately and all that kind of stuff. And so in that world of just being thoughtful and all that, are there things in this world, like world altogether today, where you are still thinking a lot about, whether it's about Screendoor or outside of Screendoor, that you think maybe as like a mic drop moment for the last of our conversation that you think people should think about, let it resonate in their and let it marinate in their minds?
Yeah, well, first of all, like thank you for the kind words, and I give a lot of credit. Like all of that is due to the fantastic mentors that I've been fortunate enough to have and get to know over the years, even back to my earliest days at EY and even up to now, and the GP advisors that I'm fortunate to work with. So again, I'm still constantly learning from them, and I love it, love it, love it. And so I owe a debt of gratitude to all of those, and I view it as a pay it forward. Right, it's a responsibility. And I think for me, the I'm always thinking about and have big plans for Screendoor, but I'm always thinking through what the right cadence and timing and steps for those are and who that impacts. I think that's critically important. But I think it's so fascinating that we're actually in the business of actually being a critic at the end of the day. When you think about building a portfolio, when you think about pipeline and building and evaluating, whether you're an investor, whether you're a founder building your team and your business, whether you're an LP and an allocator, you are constantly making choices and being critical, right? And we all pass on the 99% of what we see, right? Just as our GPs do, just as they do when they're evaluating founders. We're doing that with funds, but you can be a critic while still helping somebody, and you can be a critic while still giving empathy and doing so with respect. And that's why, again, it comes back to when you're building a firm, like, with Screendoor, we're building a firm for firm builders, by firm builders, with firm builders. And I don't know if I even got that cadence there right, but I think at the end of the day, everything in this business comes back to the people, and it comes back to the relationships. And for us, with the LPs that we work with, but also us serving as an LP, right? Even that word, right? Limited partner. We think so much more about the partner in that, not the limited. And there really shouldn't be a limit on how you can be that good partner to folks.
And I want to this also extends outside of like funds in which you invest in, because one of the folks that I hit up in preparation for this conversation was actually someone that Screendoor had turned down, specifically you had turned down. And as far as I know, this person is still sending like deals every so often to you, and it reminds me a lot of, there's this line that I first learned by reading Blake Robbins' blog, who at the time was at Ludlow Ventures, I believe now is at Benchmark. And he says, I think it might not even be original, but I first read it from him, so I'm going to give him attribution, which is the greatest compliment an investor can get is to get deal flow from someone they passed on. And you've gotten compliments back in many spades. And so to round out here, Lisa, thank you so much for your time. But this is a question I ask for everyone. There's a million places where people can find you. Also, I for people who are curious, I asked you this question when we first met, which is how like your why your LinkedIn URL, the domain URL, is the way it is. I'll leave that as a teaser. We won't answer it here, but people can follow up there. But of all the places on social media, on email, everywhere to find you, where's the best place if LPs want to reach out or GPs want to talk more to you about Screendoor?
Yeah, for sure. So there's two ways. One, you can always reach me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to connect with allocators there. We love collaborating and trading notes, and GPs as well, to get to know what you're building. And the second is, and this is critically important to Screendoor, we have an open website application that, yes, we do review every day. And yes, we have made commitments based on website submissions and getting to know folks through that. So I would encourage folks to find us on our website.
I love it. I love it. There's no better place to find you. And you are very active on LinkedIn as well. And like, I kid you not, every time I log onto LinkedIn, I'm like, Lisa Cawley liked this. Lisa Cawley reposted this. Lisa Cawley, commented on this. I'm like, oh my God. So you're active out there. You might have a bunch of DMs coming up very soon, if not already. But Lisa, thank you so much. I enjoyed every second of this.
Well, thank you for this. Thank you for the opportunity to share just a little bit about my background and my story and what drives me. And I also owe a debt of gratitude to all of the allocators and investors that I've been fortunate enough to work with, because I think I've just learned so much from them. And that to me is motivating to want to make sure to pay it forward to others. So thank you for the opportunity to chat here. I'm still confident to this day that my family does not understand what I do for a career. They either think one time I heard my mom explain to somebody that I run a hedge fund. Not true, just to be clear for the record. I
Yes.
also had somebody ask me if they could help with taxes because I am a CPA. That was part of my background, but I can't even do my own taxes probably. That's not true. I am not knowledgeable enough to be repeatably doing folks' taxes. I like to outsource that. So I don't know that comparing my home runs and my family's recognition of them, those two things don't line up. But my big home run is my daughter's walking now, so that's my personal home run right now.
Oh, that's amazing. What age did she start, or how many months back did she start walking?
We're not yet counting in the months at this point, but it's been about 4 weeks. So yeah, life has
Oh, that's
totally changed.
exciting.
Yeah. So
What was the Do you remember the moment where she started standing up on two legs? Like, was there a catalyzing moment? She was like, you had her favorite snack in your hand, and you're like, "Come and get it," kind of thing, and then she started walking. You're like, "How?" Do you remember how it happened?
it was actually our dog. So we have a chocolate lab named Murphy, and
Uh huh.
for folks that actually have worked with me for a long time, especially given the pandemic and this work from home transition, I call him my chief happiness officer because he probably is the one that's been with me on 90% of every call I've ever taken. He usually sits right there to me. If you've been lucky enough to be on a call with me and hear him snoring in the background, again, it brings like great comfort. But she was reaching for him, which is just like the perfect moment, right? Like when
Oh,
I think
that's so
about our
sweet.
family. So yeah.
I will be completely honest, and this is going to show how little EQ I have. We'll talk about the EQ IQ question in a bit as well,
Sure.
but I you got accepted. You're now in the Kauffman class 29, and as part of your, I think, like description, or like like bio for Kauffman, at the very end, I think it's the last sentence. You're like, oh, you have a chocolate lab. And I read that as you have a chocolate laboratory at home. And I'm like, oh, that's something I'd love to touch on. But then clearly I was like, maybe not anymore. One's like dog parent, one is like, okay, we know our cacao beans and all that. So
I would like to know how to stand up the that kind of lab. That would be fun.
that would be. I will say, like, one of the things, and this is going on a sidetrack a little bit, but one of the things I've thoroughly enjoyed, um, is, so first of all, I love eating, and um, actually, both you and I come from this kind of past, but I think you do it far better than I do. But as you know, swimmers have immense appetites.
Hmm.
I used to be a swimmer as well. Like, I did it in high school, did club swimming and all that kind of stuff. Um, and at one point, I don't know if I should be ashamed to say this or not, but the boys on our team, we were all eating like 9 to 10,000 calories a day, which is an insane amount of calories just to even think about. I don't eat that much anymore. I eat like regular people, like I think a little bit more, like 2,500 or so, but nevertheless, like normal people stuff. Um, but in that transition, when I stopped swimming to when I just started like working and like getting into venture and all that kind of stuff, um, there was a flight from quantity to quality of food. And in that flight to quality, I ended up falling in love with just like how people made food. So every time I go to a restaurant and I thoroughly enjoyed it, I was like, I've got to ask someone, like, okay, what's the recipe behind this? How did you make this? And there have been 3 times in my life when I've asked that question, like when I asked for the recipe, where the chef was like, hey, if you come back 5 a.m. on a Saturday, I'll teach you how to make it, which has been really helpful. Anyways, over time, I've gotten to know a lot of restaurateurs, and one of the folks I've gotten to know are the folks in Chicago, like Alinea, like
Mm. Yeah.
Nick Kokonis, as well as Grant Achatz.
Granite, yeah.
Um, and speaking of chocolate laboratories, the two of them, more specifically Grant, think very deeply on all the molecular gastronomic things you can do with chocolate. And there are different starches you can also add in chocolate. For example, if you add anything with Ultratex 3, it turns into a bubblegum texture after you freeze it. But that literally becomes a chocolate laboratory in the truest sense of that word.
Hmm.
Sorry, long preamble to it's possible.
Yeah, no, and well, funny enough that you say that about food. So during the pandemic, when everybody was, scrambling, trying to find like these new activities, right? Because life and schedules were turned upside down. I actually took over 80 virtual cooking classes from, I don't know if you know Chef Kelsey Barnard Clark. So she was on Top Chef.
Yeah.
She's based in down in Dothan, Alabama, but she was doing, by way of her also keeping her business going, she would do virtual cooking classes over Zoom. And so we ended up, I actually wouldn't cook during the class. I would watch the class and take notes like a good
Uh
student. And then afterwards be able to go and like go at my own pace to
Right.
make whatever the recipe or the ingredients were. And so I have this like big binder of all the the recipe pages in plastic. I call it the Book of Kelsey, which is just like my pandemic project, and I have them all. These are the good appetizer ones, and of course, because we did that over the course of probably, gosh, it was probably like 14 months worth of classes. But that spans an entire year. So you have everything from, in January when everybody's hitting it, trying to be really healthy. You have I distinctly remember around Father's Day, it's dad burgers, and there's like a really great recipe for just like a holistic burger. There's 4th of July, there's getting into Thanksgiving, and then of course all of the holiday and different festivities, right? Everything from sweets to big ornate meals to just simple appetizers. So honestly, I my one fun fact that I usually share with folks is if I was not doing the work that I'm doing today, and I didn't have to think about resources and all that good stuff, because I think being in a restaurant is a really, really insanely tough business. It would be my dream to go to culinary school. And I actually have, and some of my colleagues and peers know this, I have in my head and also somewhat on a Google sheet somewhere, a map of exactly how I would put my dream restaurant into existence, and right down to the name, the franchising plan, the expansion plan, of course the menu, not to forget that. But that's my side gig if I ever foray into that.
Uh, this is that is a conversation in and of itself.
Yes. We
And
can't share the details, right? Because competitive advantage. I got to keep my plan
competitive
under wraps until I unveil it to the
well,
world.
I mean, this is something that Beezer once told me. I think it probably equally applies in the world of maybe it applies in food. Maybe it applies less in the creative pursuits. And I'd say culinary is probably one of those creative pursuits where she says like there's no such thing as proprietary deal flow, but there is a such thing as proprietary access to deal flow. And so there's a good chance the menu in which you have the way you think about franchising is not proprietary, but you might just be early on in the curve just enough where for a few years or a few months you have something special that no one else has thought about or no one else has commercialized before. Um, man, I mean, like we haven't even gotten to the episode yet, and I'm like, oh man, I want to ask you
Well,
about the
one more note
menu.
on that is that
Yeah,
too. I think a lot of times it's not necessarily about what you're doing, right? Because to your point, and this applies to venture, right? Like we can talk about my dream restaurant. We can talk about it in relation to venture, but it's not necessarily about what you're doing, what's on the menu, how you serve your clients, or the actions you're taking when you're serving stakeholders. But I think it's actually about how you conduct yourself and how you're doing it, and that's often what sets you apart. You could be doing the same action as somebody else at its core, but if you're making it's how you make people feel as you're going through
yes.
the process. So that's what I
Um,
think is proprietary.
there's a great Zig Ziglar line, and it also reminds me of the things that Will Guidara at Love Madison, what he did, and Danny Meyer and all that. But the Zig Ziglar line is, "People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care." And I think in the hospitality business, the restaurant business, even in venture, let's be honest,
Mhm.
showing that you care about the person who is sitting opposite of you matters and goes so much further than just spitting facts or a pitch
Yeah,
deck or I don't know any version of a transactional relationship.
yeah, and showing that you care too. It doesn't always have to be a volume of actions. I think
Yeah.
sometimes the most important thing is to know when you need to step out and when you need to get out of the way. And that also, in and of itself, can be an act of caring, because you're letting that person, lean in without, training wheels or trying to, inadvertently hold them back.
Oh yeah. and it's this, oh man, this is a discussion in and of itself. But um there's so many parallels also to like parenting, right? Like when when one of the I think this is Sarah who first told me this. Sarah Smith at the Sarah Smith Fund,
Yeah.
who is awesome in so many ways. And the analogy in which she used it in the context of both parenting as well as like mentoring kind of portfolio companies.
Mm.
And I think there's a parallel also to like LPs to GPs kind of thing, right? Which is the sandbox. It's a sandbox analogy where when your kid is playing on the playground, they can do everything they want. They can go up the slide, they can like go on the swings, they can do crazy things. But your job as a parent when your kid is playing at the playground is not to stop them from going up and down the slide or to like, stop them from going backwards on a swing. Your job is when they are going to fall, you are there to protect them when they do fall. But outside of that, you kind of give them free reign.
Mm.
And I find that to be like very powerful in a lot of ways.
Yeah, totally.
Um, okay, we haven't even started. Well, there's a good chance. I'll be honest. There's a good chance a lot of this actually makes it into the recording because this is meat to the potatoes. This is meat to the bones. So, anyways, I want to give a special shout out to today's sponsor, Alchemist Accelerator. Backed by the likes of Coastal Ventures, Mayfield, Salesforce, just to name a few, Alchemist is the top B2B startup accelerator that's been around since 2012, backing founders from day one. And if you've been around for 12 years and running laser focused only on one industry, you build this incredible set of flywheels, and positive feedback loop is absolutely insane. We back the best enterprise talent who go on to change the world in which we live in, who then come back to their hometown, coach, and mentor the next generation of world-class enterprise talent. And don't take it just from me. Alchemist has backed the likes of Launch Darkly, Rigetti, Privacera, Mo Engage, Farmwise, just to name a few, many of which who have come back as mentors and coaches for the current classes of Alchemist. If you're curious and want to get more involved in the Alchemist ecosystem, check out alchemistaccelerator.com/superclusters. That's an S at the beginning, an S at the end, and we'll include the link in the show notes below. Till next, stay awesome. Hey Superclusters fans, David from Post here, and if you're tuning in from Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever podcasts find your ear, it'd mean the world to me if you left a review. For those from the YouTube universe, let me know if you agree or disagree in the comments, and it'd mean a lot to me if you could share this episode with just one other person who'd get a kick out of today's topics. I'm on the road to publishing to at least 100 episodes of Superclusters, so every comment, question, review helps me make this experience more helpful, exciting, and fun for you. And lastly, I want to share a quick disclaimer. The views expressed in this episode are for informational purposes only and are solely the views of myself and the guest alone. They are not representative of Alchemist Accelerator. None of the views expressed herein constitute legal, investment, business, or tax advice. Any allusions or references to funds or companies are for illustrative purposes only and should not be relied upon as investment recommendations. Consult a professional investment advisor prior to making any investment decisions. And that's all from me. See you on the next.